Hi, I'm Charvi Narayan. I'm a senior editor at Nature Neuroscience. We are at the 79th Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Symposium on quantitative biology, and this year's topic is cognition. And today I'm joined by Deborah Walley, who's at the University of Rochester as well as the University of Geneva. And we're going to talk about Daphne's work, which is on video games. So, do you want to tell us about that, Daphne?
Sure. Well, first, thanks very much for having me today. I'm interested in brain plasticity and learning and how we can help people learn better. And it is really in this context that I've become interested in video games as a tools to enhance the ability of children, young adults, older adults to better learn.
So what kind of changes do you find in people who either play video games, or do you also try training people who haven't previously played video games to play them?
So we chanced totally upon video games in the early 2000s, where we discovered that probably the worst kind of video games you can think of, that is a first-person or third-person shooter games, may actually have potential benefits effect. And what we saw is that the benefits were not just on being better at playing video games, but transferred to a number of skills, like how well you see, how well you pay attention, how well you make decisions, and that's really drawn our interest. And to really establish that work, what we do is we don't just compare people that play those games versus people that play other games. We also do training studies where we ask people to come to the lab and we force them to play one of two games, either an action video game, those like first-person or third-person shooter games, or a control game, which is also a game coming from the entertainment industry that people find engaging and that they like playing, but doesn't have the same game mechanics.
I see. So these are people who've previously not played a video game, or not video game players, and you bring them in and you train them in different kinds of video games, and you find that there's a difference between the people who are playing an action video game, a first-person shooter, versus something which is not a first-person shooter. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so we take people. It's almost impossible to find on an American campus people that don't play video games, but we take people that play video games lightly and don't engage in regular habitual video game play. And for example, in our work on vision, we've been able to show that if I force you to play an action video game for like small sessions, so it's no excuse for binging, like about like 30 minutes to 1 hour per day, 5 days of a week for a period of 8 weeks, I can improve how well you see, like the kind of things right now that are being corrected with either lenses or glasses. And other video games don't have the same effect.
I see. So by using people who previously not played video games, does this suggest that this is actually a sort of causal effect, that it's not just the fact that people who play video games tend to have better visual function, or the sort of things that you're looking at? Is that right?
Yeah, so what's exciting to us is that because we can induce that effect, and that effect is long-lasting, it's not that after a few days the benefits are lost, but they last for days. We can show they last for months. We even went into one study up to 1 to 2 years and the effects were still there. So because these effects can be induced and last, we can begin to consider the use of these effects for rehabilitation of patients, for example. So we're applying that right now to low vision patients that have suffering from amblyopia, or education systems, because in education what we want is an intervention that is going to have a long-lasting effect on boosting the type of content or skill that we want the children to learn.
So it's interesting though that you're finding effects which might otherwise be altered by using things like glasses or sort of eye patching. So and presumably video games aren't sort of changing things like eyesight. The effect that the training that you're giving it is happening at what sort of level would it be happening?
So we know from brain imaging studies, either using EEG or fMRI, that the effects are really at the level of the cortex. So you're right, when we look at patients with low vision, we are not affecting how the eye works. Those patients have that part of the vision corrected with glasses. But what happened with amblyopia, which is really people suffering from abnormal vision early in life, and because of that abnormal vision, the trajectory of their visual system, of the development of their visual system is wrong, and their visual cortex is miswired, really. And it's hard to change. And it can be changed with patching, but patching works in about 65% of the children, so it still means that there are 35-40% of patients that actually don't recover their vision. And what's exciting now is that we know that we can go to this adult patient that if you go to a vision clinic, you're going to be told, look, you're beyond the critical period for visual plasticity. There is nothing we can do for you. And we know that now with targeted training like these, we can actually help them recover vision, even though they are beyond the critical period for vision. They're adults, and we know that adults' brains are not very plastic. But one of the things we have learned is that with the right trigger, and in particular some kind of video games, we seem to really be able to unlock much more plasticity than what we thought was possible before.
That's really interesting. So for a non-specialist audience, would you explain what is amblyopia and what sort of deficits these adults might have, which would otherwise be sort of quite difficult to fix?
Sure. So you probably have seen little children with an eye patch.
Right.
These are children suffering from amblyopia, meaning that very early during development, there was something wrong with their eyes, either because of strabismus, the eyes were deviated, or because there was clouding in the vitreous humor, and so the light was not going through properly. These deficits usually are noticed a little bit later, and they can be corrected. The issue is that during that time period where vision was not properly happening in that eye, the visual cortex begins to set up, and it sets up in the wrong way. So there's a dominant eye that tends to inhibit the amblyopic eye. One of the things we do with patching is to try to reverse that inhibition. So we actually forcing the amblyopic eye to work. So we patch the good eye, we force the amblyopic eye to work. This is usually not very well accepted by the children. As I told you, it doesn't always work. And what we're looking at is a possibility of actually really forcing the two eyes to relearn to work together, so that these patients can recover good vision in their amblyopic eye, but also recover something we don't think about because you and I have it, take it for granted, which is depth perception.
I see.
So these patients really suffer from lack of what we call stereo vision. They don't see depth. There is a number of reports from patients with amblyopia where right now we're sitting and we're seeing trees, a lovely scenery, but they don't realize there's space between the branch of a tree. They just see that all in one plane. And so that kind of skill is something you need for driving, something you need in many job-related conditions. And if you have that problem, for example, as a kid, you're going to be very bad at sports. All little amblyopic kids report it's really hard for them to function in terms of catching the ball. They can't really estimate where the distance is. Sports are actually really difficult. Amblyopic patients report using a lot of strategy over the years to try to cope with their deficits. So there is part of the visual field where their vision is not very good, so they always sit on one corner of the class. They will sit at the front row. They try to avoid sports at all costs. And once you reopen the possibility of having normal vision, it's really a large improvement in the quality of life.
So that really sounds life-changing, and it's quite interesting that you get changes in 3D perception in what would seem to me to be a 2D stimulus, because it's just pictures on the screen. So what is the video game doing in order to affect all of these big changes?
So it's a very good question you're asking. The initial research we did was with commercially available video games being played like you would play at your place. Now when we apply our work to patients, we're taking all the tools and everything we have learned about brain plasticity and applying it. So they're not playing exactly your commercially available game anymore. We have changed the game a lot. First, we simplify the game a lot because these are people that don't see very well, so you can't play a very difficult game if you don't see very well. Second thing is we get people to play through what we call the stereoscope. So we basically are sending separate images to the two eyes. There's an image that goes to the right eye, an image that goes to the left eye. Think about the headset, the Oculus VR recently have received a lot of press about having this 3D immersive environment. That's where the kind of experience that we're looking to have. What we do also is we change the game. So we put specific challenges in the image that goes to the amblyopic eye. Little Gabor patch, if you're not in vision, you won't know what it is, but this is something preferred tool of vision scientists to make sure we have a whole range of spatial frequency we can manipulate. And if the patient doesn't properly detect and act on that Gabor patch, which happens only in the amblyopic eye, then it transforms into a bad, nasty robot, which is hard to kill. So it's embedded into the gameplay. And so we do many, many different changes like that to promote fusion, to make sure that there is less suppression between the two eyes and the two eyes can work together, to have depth challenges so that we can retrain the patients to truly see in a functional way.
And what sort of brain changes happen in parallel? So you mentioned fMRI and EEG. So what do you see, what is actually happening in the cortex to correlate with this sort of behavior?
So we're just scratching the surface, but from the studies we know that there are many different changes, and the main changes have to do in what we call a network, which is dedicated to control attention. And so it's a network of areas that include the frontal cortex, like prefrontal cortex, the parietal cortex, the cingulate cortex. They're all very important in controlling how you locate attention, how you select what's relevant for the task, how you ignore distraction. And that network changes in its efficiency in people that play those action video games. And we think that may actually feed back into earlier, like for example, visual areas, and enhance the plasticity of those areas. But it's still something that we need to check, that we're giving you an hypothesis right now.
And why do you think it's in particular action video games which are effective in sort of producing both these neural and these behavioral effects? So what is it about one particular kind of video games which makes them more effective than others?
So this is a very good question, something we're working on by having a game designer actually designing for us an action video game from scratch so that we can manipulate the different components. But I can give you a number of elements we have already identified as being important. One of them is what we call pacing, the fact that you have to make decisions in real time. It doesn't really matter that it be fast. The real time of an 85-year-old is going to be slow to an 18-year-old. What it matters is that it's adapted to your level of speed, so that it's actually something where you feel you have to perform on the spot. The other thing that we know is important in those games is distributed attention, the need to actually at all time pay attention to everything which is around you and really be able to move attention very flexibly through the whole scene. Another aspect, and there's a long list, so we won't do all of it, but another aspect to give you a feel is that these games actually have enough complexity that there are many goals and sub-goals you need to plan for, and you need to revise all the time your planning because new events may have happened. And that revision and prediction are really important, which is very different from mini games or like small, brain apps where it's very simple. And so as a result, you don't have at all that level of need to predict what's going to happen next, and in fact to learn what are sort of the regularities in your game environment so that you can play better.
So what sort of future work are you planning to chase down the sort of avenues you found with this graphing?
So there are a number of different avenues we're looking at. First, we're looking at the different components in the game that will be important to have to trigger that kind of plasticity. And it may be different with different age range. That's something we're interested in. The older adults may be different than young adults, for example. But we're also looking at direct application to schools and looking at developing video games to enhance some of these very core basic abilities that we know are important during the development in school. And one of them, for example, is in mathematics, which is called the number sense. So we all have a rough idea of how many objects are around us. We would know that here there is not 100 people, there is not like 2, but there is a little bit more. Babies also have that ability, but what's interesting is that from babies all the way through development, the resolution of that system improves. And what I mean is that babies can distinguish between 1 and 2 objects, but adults can distinguish between 7 and 10 objects, which babies can't do. And what has been shown by my collaborator on that project just in Alberta at Johns Hopkins is that the resolution of that system is a very good predictor of how well you do in school on mathematics topics, so paper and pencils in school. And we also know that the kind of games we've been talking about enhance your number sense. And so we're looking into building a game that meshes together the game mechanics and number sense challenge and looking at the impact of that game on school mathematics.
So what sort of ages would these games be targeting then?
So right now the game we're developing is targeted at an age range of about 7 to 9 years old, and we're trying also to make sure we target female and males, because as you probably know, the action genre is much more popular with boys than with girls. So there's a lot of reflection around how to develop a game that has the right mechanics but would be appealing to girls. We think it's perfectly feasible, but we're working on that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Daphne. That was completely brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.